My name is, well, it's better you know me as that police officer. Today we're going to look into the shocking story of a heartbreaking story of a 9-year-old girl found dead near a river after walking her dog. This case is one that will stay with you long after you hear it, so brace yourselves as we uncover the details. Some cases stay with you, long after the reports are filed, long after the evidence is cataloged, and long after the suspect is in custody. They become a part of you, like a shadow you can't shake. This case was one of those. I still remember the call that came in that night. A missing child, just 9 years old. Her name was Laura Valentina Paez. She had gone out with her dog and never came back. As a police officer, I've been trained to remain calm and methodical under pressure, but there's something about the disappearance of a child that shakes even the steadiest of hands. Laura's mother had been working late, trying to make ends meet, and when she got home in the early hours of the morning, she found her daughter's bed empty. No one in the neighborhood had seen anything. No one heard a sound. But the worry in her voice, her fear, it's something you don't forget. We mobilized immediately, combing through streets, alleys, and fields in Chiquinquirá. The community came together, flashlights in hand, calling out Laura's name into the cold night air. But as the hours stretched into days, a realization began to sink in. This wasn't going to end the way we hoped. Then came the break, a grainy security video that showed Laura talking to a man. She was trusting. She was innocent. She got into his car, completely unaware of the danger she was walking into. We would come to know the name Daniel Josue Zambrano Cáceres. But back then, he was just a shadowy figure in a video, a man we had to find before it was too late. What followed was a case that tested all of us. It tested our resolve, our patience, and our faith in the world around us. What happened to Laura Paez is a story of heartbreak, of darkness, and of a community that refused to give up. But make no mistake, this isn't an easy story to tell. And it won't be an easy story to hear. The night Laura Valentina Paez went missing started like any other in the small, close-knit city of Chiquinquirá, Colombia. It was January 16th, 2025, and the streets were winding down for the evening. Families were settling in, shops were closing, and the hum of daily life was giving way to the quiet of night. But for one family, this night would mark the beginning of a nightmare. Laura, just 9 years old, was a lively and kind-hearted girl. That evening, she had taken her dog out for a routine walk, a familiar part of her day. Her mother, a street vendor who worked tirelessly to provide for her family, wasn't home at the time. She returned from her shift around 3 a.m., weary from long hours under the city's lights, expecting to find her daughter asleep in her bed. Instead, she found it empty. At first, there was disbelief, a sense of denial that anything could be wrong. But as minutes stretched into agonizing hours, fear set in. Laura hadn't returned. Her dog wasn't there, and no one in the neighborhood had seen or heard anything unusual. The police were contacted almost immediately. As an officer, you prepare yourself for moments like this. Missing persons, calls that demand precision and speed. But when it's a child, it's different. There's an unspoken urgency, a pressure that tightens with every passing second. We began the search right away, rallying neighbors and volunteers, flooding the streets with flashlights and shouts of her name. At first, we clung to hope. Maybe she had wandered too far and gotten lost. Maybe she'd fallen asleep in a nearby field or taken shelter in a neighbor's home. But as night turned to day and no sign of Laura emerged, the gravity of the situation became clearer. This wasn't a simple case of a child wandering off. Something was terribly wrong. The first major breakthrough came from a grainy piece of security footage captured by a nearby camera. In the clip, Laura could be seen walking down the sidewalk, her small frame illuminated by the streetlights. She stopped to talk to a man she seemed to trust. He wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was calm, composed, someone she willingly followed. Moments later, she climbed into his car. The man was quickly identified as Daniel Josue Zambrano Cáceres, a local fruit vendor known in the community. He wasn't an outsider, not someone who would immediately raise suspicion. But sometimes the greatest threats come from those who blend in seamlessly with their surroundings. Cáceres was brought in for questioning, but he denied knowing Laura or having any involvement in her disappearance. As the days passed, we followed every lead, but the search was overshadowed by growing dread. Then 5 days later, on January 21st, our worst fears were confirmed. Laura's body was discovered at the mouth of the Monero River, about 45 miles from her home. The scene was devastating, a tragic end to a search that had begun with so much hope. The discovery of Laura's body sent shockwaves through Chiquinquirá. Parents held their children closer, neighbors exchanged wary glances, and a sense of loss hung heavy in the air. It was clear that this was no ordinary case. This wasn't just a crime, it was an assault on the very heart of a community that prided itself on its safety and unity. As investigators, it was now our responsibility to piece together the events of that night, to bring justice to Laura and her family. The investigation was far from over, and what we uncovered would reveal a darkness that no one in our small city could have imagined. We'll dive deeper into the details of the investigation, the evidence, the suspect, and the moments that brought us closer to the truth. But for now, let this serve as a reminder. In cases like these, it's not just about solving a crime. It's about honoring the memory of an innocent life, cut short far too soon. The investigation into Laura Valentina Paez's disappearance began the moment we received the call. Every missing persons case carries its own weight, but when it involves a child, it's impossible not to feel the pressure. Time becomes your greatest enemy. With each passing hour, the odds of finding the child safe decrease, and as a police officer, that knowledge sits heavy on your shoulders. Our first priority was to establish a timeline. When was Laura last seen? Who was the last person to interact with her? And most importantly, where had she gone? Her mother provided the first details. Laura had taken her dog for a walk early that evening, a routine she followed regularly. It wasn't uncommon in their neighborhood. Chiquinquirá was a place where most people felt safe letting their kids roam nearby. But by the time her mother returned from her late-night shift, Laura was gone. The search effort was massive. Officers, volunteers, and neighbors canvassed the area, going door to door, combing through fields and wooded paths. It was a coordinated effort, but as the hours turned into days, our optimism began to waver. Each tip, each lead, felt like it might be the breakthrough we needed, only to lead us back to the same devastating question. Where was Laura? We turned to technology for answers. Surveillance footage became the focus of our attention. Cameras mounted on shops and street corners were reviewed frame by frame. It's a painstaking process, watching hours of mundane recordings. But in cases like this, one tiny detail could change everything. And then we found it. The footage wasn't perfect, grainy and slightly out of focus, but it was enough. Laura was walking down the street with her dog, just as her mother had described. She paused near a man, and they exchanged a few words. He didn't seem threatening. In fact, Laura appeared calm, trusting. That's the part that always gets to me. She wasn't frightened. She willingly got into his car, her dog trailing behind. Identifying the man became our next priority. He wasn't wearing anything distinctive, but the footage captured enough of his face to begin piecing things together. It didn't take long for someone to recognize him. Daniel Josue Zambrano Cáceres, a fruit vendor who worked nearby. He wasn't a stranger to the community. Many people knew him, or at least recognized his face. Cáceres was brought in for questioning. Sitting across from him in the interrogation room, I couldn't help but study his demeanor. He was calm, almost too calm, and adamant in his denial. He claimed he didn't know Laura, had never seen her before, but his story didn't hold up. As we dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. Witnesses reported seeing his car near the area where Laura had vanished, and Cáceres couldn't explain his whereabouts that night. The turning point came when we searched his vehicle. It was there, among the cluttered interior, that we found evidence we couldn't ignore. Traces of bodily fluids and strands of hair were discovered, materials that would later be sent for forensic analysis. It wasn't the smoking gun we needed to close the case, but it was enough to keep Cáceres under scrutiny. As the investigation continued, our hope of finding Laura alive began to dwindle. 5 days after she disappeared, those fears were confirmed. Laura's body was discovered at the mouth of the Monero River, miles away from her home. It was a discovery that left even the most seasoned officers shaken. She was just a child. Recovering her body was only the beginning of what would become an even more grueling phase of the investigation. We had to piece together how she ended up there, and more importantly, why. Every detail mattered. Witnesses who had initially been hesitant to come forward began sharing what they knew. Slowly, a picture started to form. Caceres had been seen near the river days before Laura's body was found, and his car had been spotted on a remote road leading to the area. One of the hardest parts of this case was the waiting. We had evidence, but much of it needed to be processed. DNA tests, toxicology reports, forensic analyses. Those things take time, and every moment spent waiting felt like an eternity. But we couldn't rush it. We needed to ensure that when the time came, we had a case strong enough to bring justice for Laura. What struck me most during this process was the resilience of Laura's family and the community. Despite their grief, they showed up every day demanding answers, refusing to let Laura's memory fade. It was their determination that kept us going, even when the investigation seemed to hit a wall. By the time we were ready to formally charge Caceres, the evidence against him was overwhelming. His car, the DNA, his inconsistent alibi, it all pointed to one conclusion. But even as the case moved closer to resolution, the weight of what had happened never left us. This wasn't just another investigation. It was a reminder of the vulnerability of those we're sworn to protect, a call to remain vigilant, and a testament to the importance of seeking justice no matter how long or arduous the process might be. We'll dive into what we uncovered next, how each piece of evidence came together to tell Laura's story, and the steps we took to ensure her voice was heard. Because this case, more than any other, reminded us that every action we take matters. Every detail can make the difference between finding the truth and letting it slip away. The arrest of Daniel Josue Zambrano Caceres marked the beginning of a new phase in the case of Laura Valentina Paz. While the investigation had been harrowing, the legal process was an entirely different battlefield. Our work as officers had brought us to this point, but now it was up to the justice system to ensure that Laura's voice was heard and her family's pain was given the resolution it deserved. The charges brought against Caceres were severe: kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. The evidence against him was damning, and yet, as we prepared for the trial, there was a lingering tension in the air. Justice isn't guaranteed, even when the facts seem undeniable. Prosecutors were meticulous in their approach, knowing full well that the defense would do everything in their power to poke holes in the case. The trial began in a packed courtroom, the air heavy with anticipation. Laura's family sat in the front row, their grief etched on their faces. It was impossible not to feel the weight of their loss, the emptiness left behind by a life taken far too soon. As officers, we had seen countless cases, but this one was different. It wasn't just a child we were fighting for. It was an entire community shaken to its core. The prosecution laid out its case methodically, starting with the surveillance footage that showed Laura walking with Caceres and willingly getting into his car. The grainy video became a cornerstone of the case, a silent witness to the beginning of the tragedy. Next came the forensic evidence, the traces of DNA found in Caceres' car, which matched Laura's. This was presented alongside testimony from forensic experts who described in painstaking detail how the evidence was analyzed and verified. But the most chilling moments came when the prosecution revealed the timeline of events leading up to Laura's death. Witnesses recounted seeing Caceres near the Monero River days before her body was discovered. Others described his behavior in the days following her disappearance: erratic, nervous, and uncharacteristically withdrawn. Piece by piece, the story unfolded, painting a grim picture of a man who had betrayed the trust of a child and her community. Caceres' defense team, however, fought back aggressively. They questioned the reliability of the surveillance footage, suggesting that the image quality was too poor to definitively identify him. They attempted to cast doubt on the forensic evidence, arguing that it could have been contaminated or misinterpreted, and they sought to portray Caceres as a scapegoat, a man wrongfully accused in a case that had gripped the public's imagination. But as the trial progressed, the cracks in the defense's arguments became increasingly apparent. The evidence was simply too strong, the connections too clear to ignore. And then there was Caceres himself. He had chosen to testify, a decision that surprised many. On the stand, he maintained his innocence, but his composure faltered under cross-examination. When asked to explain his whereabouts on the night Laura disappeared, his answers were vague and inconsistent. His attempts to explain the DNA evidence were equally unconvincing. As officers, we watched the proceedings with a mixture of hope and apprehension. We had done our part, but now it was out of our hands. We could only hope that the jury would see the case for what it was, a clear and undeniable act of violence against an innocent child. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and overwhelming sorrow. Laura's family clung to one another, tears streaming down their faces. For them, this was a moment of closure, but not healing. No verdict could bring Laura back. Cáceres was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, he showed no visible reaction, his face a mask of indifference. But for everyone else in that courtroom, the moment was profound. Justice had been served, but at an unimaginable cost. Walking out of the courtroom that day, I couldn't shake the feeling of how deeply this case had affected all of us. It wasn't just about the legal outcome. It was about the loss of a young girl who had her entire life ahead of her. It was about a family that would never be whole again and a community that had lost its sense of safety. This case will always stay with me, not just because of the horrors it uncovered, but because of what it represented. It was a reminder of the importance of perseverance, of leaving no stone unturned in the pursuit of justice. And most importantly, it was a reminder that every action we take as officers has the power to make a difference, for better or for worse. For Laura and her family, I can only hope we made the right one. There are some cases that leave an indelible mark, not just on the families involved, but on everyone who touches them. Laura Valentina Pius's case was one of those. It wasn't just about the evidence we gathered, the trial we sat through, or even the verdict that followed. It was about the profound sense of loss. A life cut short, a family shattered, and a community that will never be the same. For me, the case served as a sobering reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that can exist where we least expect it. Laura's story wasn't just another file on our desk or another statistic to add to the crime logs. It was a stark illustration of how easily trust can be manipulated, how quickly safety can be stolen. She was just a child, full of life, joy, and dreams for a future that was cruelly taken from her. That's what sticks with you the most, the realization that she'll never grow up, never get to see the milestones in life that most of us take for granted. The impact on her family was devastating, and no amount of justice could ever fill the void left behind. Watching Laura's mother and loved ones sit in that courtroom, enduring every detail of the trial, was both heart-wrenching and inspiring. Their strength in the face of such unimaginable pain was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But no matter how strong they appeared, the grief was always there, lingering in their eyes, a constant reminder of what they'd lost. The community, too, bore the weight of this tragedy. Chiquinquirá, once a quiet and trusting place, became a town haunted by its own loss of innocence. Parents who once let their children play freely now watched them with a more cautious eye. Neighbors who had once felt a sense of security now questioned how well they really knew the people around them. It's a ripple effect that cases like this often leave behind, and it's something that's hard to repair. As for us, the officers who worked the case, it left its own scars. In this line of work, you try to separate yourself emotionally, to approach each case with professionalism and objectivity. But there are always those moments that break through the barriers you've built. Seeing Laura's face on missing posters, walking the streets where she was last seen, and finally uncovering the truth of what happened to her, it all stays with you. It's the kind of case that wakes you up at night, makes you second-guess everything you've done, wondering if there was something more you could have done to prevent it. But if there's one thing this case taught me, it's the importance of perseverance. Every lead, every piece of evidence, every interview, it all mattered. And while the outcome will never undo the tragedy, it did bring a sense of justice, however incomplete, to Laura's family. That's why we do what we do. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Because even when the truth is hard to face, it's the truth that gives meaning to the work we dedicate our lives to. As I reflect on this case, I'm reminded of the larger responsibility we all share, not just as police officers, but as members of a society, to watch out for one another, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to ensure that no child's life is ever taken so senselessly again. Laura's story is a painful one, but it's also a call to action, a reminder to be vigilant, to care, and to never take for granted the safety and well-being of those around us. Some cases never truly leave you. They stay in your mind, shaping the way you see the world and the way you approach your work. Laura's case was one of those, and while her story may have ended in tragedy, her memory will continue to guide us, to push us to do better, to be better, and to ensure that justice is not just a word but a reality for those who need it most.